not shared, trying to take a break from preaching and the exercise of developing a message. It gives my wife a break because I tend to disappear when when I'm studying. And the other place I go is a Chinese church in Boston, and I don't speak either Mandarin or Cantonese. So you don't really get too nervous when you're looking at faces that may or may not understand you. I'm hoping that won't be the case this morning. And I also want to thank Sonia. I just deeply appreciated what you shared, your prayer this morning. It just was very good. And I also appreciated Ed and Lorna's reading. Grace is an interesting dynamic because, as with many of the things of God, we can become familiar with them. And they can become stale. We can ignore them. And grace can be huge in all that it encompasses. It can be very small as well, precise, if you will. But it's a little slippery, trying to get a hold of it to preach about it as a topic. At least I found it that way. In the Gospel of John, for example, it says, "From the fullness of his grace we have all received one blessing after another." And another, and another is the understanding that I have with that phrase, that the fullness of God's grace in all that it encompasses, physically, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, all the kind of needs that we have as human beings, his grace is sufficient. An alternate reading to that verse is, "For of his fullness we have received grace upon grace, upon grace." And you can keep on going. And so our lives are dependent upon God's grace in ways that we so often may not even recognize. I'm sure all of you, your testimony would reflect God's grace and how good God has been to you, his caring, his tender mercies, his compassion, leading and guiding, as God is wont to do. That's his nature. So my personal experience with God's grace has been in many, many ways. One of the ways is physically, my physical health. So when I was born, they looked at me and said, "Well, he's blue." Blue baby. Have you heard of blue babies? Being white, I should have been pink, but I was blue. And so, not because I was sad or depressed, mind you, as far as I remember, but an oxygenation problem. And they didn't discover my issue for about 18 months because I was born in the 50s. Anybody else remember the 50s? 1950s? It was a long time ago. And back then, they didn't have near the pediatric care that they have today. So they didn't diagnose my issue until I was 18 months old. They found out I had a hole in my heart, about the size of a $50. So for an infant's heart to have a hole that size was fairly serious. It's called the atrial septal defect, ASD. And they said to my parents, "Keep him alive for 7 years and bring him back." Easy task, right, for parents. And they were soon to move to Brazil. So I lived the next 5 years in a very warm environment. And what I remember about Brazil is I couldn't go outside and play, so I could stay inside and play in my bathtub. The houses in Brazil had porous tile on the floor in the bathroom, so if you slop water all over the edge, it disappeared right down into the tile. So I just really loved water back then. Rubber duckies, and boats, and I survived. So at the age of 7, they brought me back to the hospital, and the surgeon said, "Yes, okay, we're going to do the surgery. We're going to put a patch, a Teflon patch over the hole, and that will allow the muscle to grow in between, and eventually the patch dissolves." And they had to repair the mitral valve, which is one of the 4 valves in the heart, because the hole went up into the mitral valve. It's an important valve, which I found out later. I survived the surgery, and after about a month, I began to grow and put on weight. I was very petite, believe it or not. Thin, weak, everything that went with having heart problems. So then, let's go forward about 60 years. I began to struggle with weakness, and tiredness, and I couldn't quite figure it out. I tried to carry my granddaughter when we were in Bangkok, and I could go a block, and I just ran out of steam. So we got back to Needham. I went to see my PCP. He said, go get an x-ray. And I eventually got there, got the x-ray. He called me up. Friday night, we were trying to have movie and pizza night with our grandkids. We were having. And he calls up and says, Daryl, you have to get to the hospital. I'm having pizza movie with my grandkids, Doc. I'll go tomorrow morning. No, you won't. If you want to die, stay away. Oh my, what do you do when a doctor says that? So I went to the hospital, and they said my lungs were a third full with fluid. And my doctor thought you might have cancer. It's the x-ray was dark, and it was very disconcerting. The ER doctor said, no, it's not cancer, but it is cardiac issue. Your heart's not able to get the water out of your system. Oh, brother, another cardiac issue. Come to find out that my mitral valve that had been repaired when I was 7 is now really calcified. It's not functioning properly. It was damaging a tricuspid, another valve in the heart, and it gave me serious pulmonary hypertension. So I had a lot of pressure in my lungs that was just causing a lot of problems. So you need a new valve, son, the doctor says. You can get a biological valve, like a cow valve, bovine, or you can have an artificial, right? Those are the two options. So he said, if you get the biological, then you'll need another valve in about 10 years, 12 years. I thought, a third open heart surgery? No way. We prayed, my wife and I prayed, and we said, we'll go with the artificial. Because he said, that will outlive the whole rest of your body. That's good news. So, but the thing of an artificial valve is you have to take blood thinner. So I take blood thinner, so I got to manage that. And so all along the way, my point with that long story is that God has been with us. We have seen his grace in so many ways. We just happen to be in Boston, where some of the best heart surgeons in the world exist. The Shapiro Center at Brigham and Women's. It's like a hotel there. I'd recommend it if you're going to the hospital. Just grace upon grace that we have experienced, as John 1:16 says. And then verse 17 says, for the law was given through Moses, the 10 Commandments, right? But what came through Jesus? Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And John likes to couple these two dynamics of the kingdom of heaven and of God together. I think is very powerful. Grace and truth. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Jesus came to minister to us God's grace and God's truth. We know how important truth is, right? Truth helps us, protects us from the lies and the deceptions of the enemy. Very, very important for us to be overcomers. But grace, then, how does that fit into the picture? It covers so much of life and our walk with Jesus. Grace, God's grace. And Jesus is full of God's grace. Oftentimes when we think of grace, we think of salvation. And I think, Pastor, you covered this with your sermons on Romans. And the work of grace for forgiveness and salvation, very, very important. And we think of Ephesians 2, for by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not of yourselves. It's the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. So God's grace is given to us. We don't earn it. We don't work for it. We don't even deserve it. In fact, that's part of the definition of grace, right? Unmerited, undeserved favor of God. That is what he wants to work in our lives for us to recognize his amazing grace that he has for us. We don't qualify for it. I think that was in the reading this morning. Who among any of the Christmas story characters were qualified for their work and their efforts? So God repaired my heart, and both physically, and he also brought me to Jesus. When I was about 15, I had long hair. I was sort of a hippie, sort of. You know, I looked like a hippie on the outside. On the inside, I didn't really like the whole hippie scene. But, you know, you had to go along to get along in high school back then. Maybe anymore, I don't know if kids have to do that. But I did, and so my parents got separated when I was 13 or 14, you know, and I thought, well, shoot, missionaries, right? They serve the church, they serve God, and now they're getting separated. Oh, that Christian stuff is baloney. But then they got back together again the very next year, and I watched, you know, I observed, I watched what they did, and I was very amazed at God's amazing grace in their lives. And my mother ended up leading me to the Lord. Thank the Lord. Blessing upon blessing, the all-encompassing work of Jesus Christ. So when we think of grace, let's not think so much of the salvation and forgiveness dynamic. Let's think of the Christmas story, all right? And all that goes in to the Christmas story, because there's a lot. They alluded to, in the reading, it was alluded to the miraculous, the power of God. And when I think of the Christmas story, I think, wow, it's pretty complicated. God is weaving together all these dynamics and all these lives, which he foretold hundreds and hundreds of years earlier through the prophets, the Jewish prophets. And so it's amazing to me as I try to keep track of all that took place or takes place in the Christmas stories and all those various actors, you know, Zechariah and Mary and Joseph and Jesus. Those are the four primary actors of the Christmas story. But then there's the secondary actors too. You have the shepherds. You have the wise men, the magicians, who are not even Jewish. You know, they're Gentile. They're profane. You have, shepherds, Simeon and Anna, the prophets that come to the temple. You even have the vile King Herod, who is part of it. You have dreams after dreams. You have angels appearing. You know, I sort of am surprised because Zechariah had been working for many years as a priest. How many years have you been pastor? 10, 12? Longer. Has Gabriel ever appeared to you?
Only about 6 or 7.
Oh.
Never.
I'm impressed. I've been, you know, after 30 years of ministry, I haven't had a single angel except for my wife who appeared. It's a little discouraging. You know, Gabriel came to Zechariah. By the way, who was Gabriel? An angel? An archangel. Oh, baby. Those are not just ordinary angels. Your run-of-the-mill angels. I think there are 2 archangels that are mentioned in the Bible. Gabriel is one. Who's the other? Michael. Michael has a tendency of getting the assignments of bad news to the people. So when he shows up, you might want to get on your face. Gabriel comes with good news. And unfortunately, Zechariah didn't get on his face. I think he was a guy, he was doing a guy thing, and he had trouble with authority. I just wonder, you know, I'll ask him when we get to heaven. But because Mary's response was spectacular. In fact, you know, she's really the first servant mentioned in the New Testament. Do you know that? Because isn't that what the answer she gave to Gabriel? Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Zechariah, God was bringing these pieces together, fitting them together, almost like my grandson putting together a 5,000-piece Lego set. Except he has instructions. God's doing it all by memory and snap and pop, and he's bringing Gabriel for Zechariah. And even before that, he was at work in preparing things. You know, with is it 300 prophecies about the Messiah that you find in the Old Testament? So God was preparing all of that, and he also prophesied about the forerunner of the Messiah. So we have all of these supernatural dreams and visions and miracles and experiences that impress me. Only God could do something like that. And it's just another testimony of God's amazing grace, of God's incredible intelligence, way beyond anything that we know as humans. And the fact that he would do it with us humans is spectacular. You know, that God would care for a wretch like me, as the hymn says. He would listen to my prayers. He would be concerned about my marriage. He'd be concerned about my kids and my grandkids. That's spectacular. So he says, Gabriel, I want you to go visit Zechariah. He's going to be in the temple. He's going to be doing his thing there. And he and his wife, Elizabeth, are going to have a baby. And what was it that qualified Zechariah and Elizabeth to be the parents of John the Baptist? Nada, which means nothing. If their righteousness and their goodness and their pedigree qualified them, I think they would have had a child much, much earlier, many years before that. But it was at this point, at this time, that Gabriel says, God has heard your prayers. And, miraculous, because Zach and Lizzie, they were quite a bit older, weren't they? And so for them to have a baby, that was really spectacular. Then God sends Gabriel to Mary to go and visit her. How old was Mary? Teenager. Yeah. Maybe like one of the girls. Now, 15, 16 back then was probably different than today, but it's still a teenager. And Gabriel is saying to her, you're going to be the mother of the Messiah, because nothing is impossible for God. Let that sink into your heart. Whatever your need is this morning, the problems, the challenges that are on your heart, nothing is impossible for God. So Mary believed, and the unthinkable becomes possible as well as marvelous. So there we have Zechariah and Mary, and then Joseph. Joseph, I don't think Mary's pregnancy was a big hit with Joseph. It was probably, he saw it as something shameful, embarrassing, horrifying maybe. What does God do? He sends an angel in Joseph's dream. So we have another supernatural event taking place. You can read about it in Matthew 1. And the angel says to Joseph, Mary's pregnancy is divine, it's of God. Name him Jesus, because he's going to rescue his people from their sins. And Joseph agrees not to divorce Mary. So now we have the three of the four main actors of the Christmas story. We're just waiting for Jesus to show up. I'm impressed with some of the details that maybe aren't spoken of in the scriptures. When Gabriel shows up, does he invite the characters to accept the charge? Zechariah, would you like to be the father of John? Mary? What do you think about this idea of God's plan? Would you approve? Could it be improved? No, nothing of that. Gabriel tells them, this is what is going to happen, and this is what we want you to do. This is how we want you to be involved. And as I alluded to earlier, there was no question about their qualifications. Gabriel didn't say, could you submit your resume, please, and we'll get back to you in a few days. Nothing like that. Indeed, not. And then Mary's response, I am the Lord's servant. May it be to me as you have said. No what ifs or ums. Did you think about this? Gabriel, I'm not so sure about that. I probably would have done that. Tried to engage Gabriel in some. Not a good idea. That didn't happen with them. So Zechariah, Mary, Joseph. Let's go to the shepherds. Why shepherds? I mean, they're sort of at the low end of the social strata. They were farmers. They were kind of stinky farmers because they hung out with the sheep all summer long. And they probably weren't very religious because when you're out in the fields all day long, how are you going to follow the cleanliness laws of Moses? Very difficult. And so it's a head scratcher. Why shepherds? They didn't show up with pomp and circumstance at the stable. Have you gotten into the royalty with Prince William and Princess? Yes. I'm fascinated by the royals. There's The Crown on Netflix. It has a lot of difficult things to watch, but that's not the shepherds. They weren't royal at all. They were, if anything, they were. On the other hand, Jesus, what did he call himself? The Good Shepherd. With all of the incredible analogies that come out of that. And King David, what was he before he was elevated to kingship? He was a shepherd. And so the position of shepherd is not to be ashamed of. It manifests humility, for which I'm grateful. Jesus said, I am humble and lowly of heart. So God included the shepherds on his invitation list to this incredible play, his amazing grace, grace upon grace. And then you have Simeon and Anna. Remember the older couple? Simeon went first into the temple. There was Jesus. He was probably, 3 months, maybe 4 months at this point, because they had to wait for Mary's purification from birth before they could go to the temple. And then they wanted to consecrate Jesus as the firstborn. And they go in. He's probably looking like a 3 or 4 month old. Cute, but nondescript. I think he was a typical 3 or 4 month baby boy. But Simeon goes in there, being nudged by the Holy Spirit and gently guided. And as soon as he sees Jesus, that's it. He's the one. He is the one, the Messiah. And he starts waxing eloquent about being ready to die because now he's seen God's Messiah, the chosen one, and he's ready to go. And all that Jesus would do, his identity, his messiahship. And then that was followed by Anna, the prophetess, the older lady who spent most of her life in the temple ministering to the Lord. And she also identified Jesus as the Messiah. And then we have the wise men, the Gentiles, who came from miles and miles and miles away. I think Pastor alluded to them last Sunday. I like the wise men, the Magi. I think they knew about the birth of the Messiah, maybe through Daniel and some of his writings hundreds of years before and got carried along. I don't know. I can't prove that. But they're foreigners, they're wise people, and they saw a light, some kind of light. Was it a star? Possibly. But they followed it all the way from their country to Jerusalem. And they probably started it quite a few months before, maybe even before Gabriel visited Zechariah. And so God was moving yet another piece of the puzzle together. And from the wise men came the gifts. and that would support Mary, Joseph, and the baby when they had to flee to Egypt, which reminds me that's another vision that Joseph had. When the angel came and said, you have to flee, get out of here. Someone is going to threaten the child, go to Egypt. And that matches what the prophet Hosea had foretold hundreds of years earlier. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. So God in his amazing grace knit together this story of Christmas, of the coming of the Messiah, and it includes these incredible visions and miracles. And I think many of you have experienced miracles in your life, which to me says the same God who is in our lives, in our hearts, is the same God who orchestrated Christmas, the whole story, all of it. And he is as equally concerned about each one of us as he was about Zechariah and Mary and Joseph and Jesus and the wise men. And Peter even affirms this in chapter 5 of 1 Peter. Cast all your cares on him. Why? He cares for you. Because he cares. Somebody cares about you and me. And it's not just your family, as important as they are. It's the God of heaven. And he would enter into our world, roll up his sleeves, and begin to snap together this puzzle of the Christmas story. And now we can think about it and remember it year after year. That is amazing grace. Do you know the hymn, Come Thou Fount? Come Thou Fount of every blessing, tune my heart to what? Sing thy grace. I am just so grateful that I could do this study because it reminded me of the layers upon layers of God's grace in my life and in all of our lives. The last verse of that hymn says this, "Oh, to grace, how great a debtor I'm constrained to be." Oh, to grace, how great a debtor. And I just appreciate that hymn so much. It talks about binding my wandering heart to him, to the Lord. Well, it says, let thy goodness like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart. Take and seal it for thy courts above. And every day, the powers of our world are pulling us, and yanking on our chains and trying to distract us and even overwhelm us and deceive us. But God's grace is there to hold us and to keep us and to bind us to himself. We all are in deep, deep debt to God's amazing grace, without which I think our lives would be so much less. So controlled by sin and darkness and evil, we would be utterly hopeless and separated from the God of wonder and of love and comfort and joy that Pastor shared last week. God is not beholding to us, but he wants to give us his grace. Isn't that amazing? Amazing grace. 2 Corinthians 9, God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. What a spectacular verse. Amazing grace, abound to us in all things, at all times, and in all ways that we need. God is on your side, and he is with you. He is Emmanuel, and he is not going to leave you. He's not going to abandon you. He's going to help you and walk with you.